The bag was sitting right there on the wet sidewalk, half open, soaked through from the rain. Owen Hatch almost walked past it. That was the thing nobody ever talked about afterward. How close he came to just stepping around it and heading home. He was already late picking up his son from the Garfield's place. Already dreading the look Mrs. Garfield would give him over the top of her reading glasses, that patient, pitying look she'd perfected over the past 14 months since Owen's wife died. He didn't need another reminder of how his life had come apart, but something made him stop. Maybe it was the way the zipper was pulled back just enough to show the edge of a brown envelope. Maybe it was some instinct left over from his years on construction sites, where you learned fast that something out of place usually meant trouble ahead. Whatever it was, Owen crouched down on that rain-slicked sidewalk in downtown Shelby, Tennessee, and he looked inside. Stacks of cash, bound with rubber bands, more money than he'd ever held in his life. He stood slowly, looked left, looked right. The street was nearly empty. Just a cab pulling away at the far end, and a woman in a yellow raincoat hurrying toward the parking garage. No one watching. No one close enough to have dropped this. Owen picked up the bag. He stood there in the rain for a long moment, his jacket soaking through at the shoulders. And he thought about his son. Brody was 7 years old and sleeping in a twin bed pushed up against the wall in their one-bedroom apartment on Caldwell Street. The bed they'd had to buy secondhand because the lease on their old place had come due 3 months after the funeral, and Owen hadn't had the money or the energy to fight for anything better. Brody's asthma had gotten worse over the winter. The specialist his pediatrician recommended cost $400 a visit, not counting the medication. Owen had been working 2 jobs, framing houses during the day, stocking shelves at a grocery store twice a week at night, and he was still 3 months behind on rent. He counted it later, at home, after Brody was asleep. Laid it out on the kitchen table under the overhead light with the window shade pulled down. $47,600. He sat there for a long time with his hands flat on the table and that money in front of him. Long enough for the refrigerator to cycle on and off twice. Long enough for a car to pass on the street below and throw its headlights across the ceiling. Long enough for every reasonable argument his brain could construct to surface and be examined. Nobody would know. The bag had no ID, no name, no phone number tucked inside, no business card, nothing but cash, and a set of keys he didn't recognize, and a torn ticket stub from a parking garage on 5th Avenue. The money wasn't marked. There was no way to trace it back to him. And Brody needed that specialist. Brody needed a better apartment, somewhere without mold behind the bathroom tiles, and a landlord who ignored maintenance requests and neighbors who played music until 2 in the morning. Owen thought about all of that. Then he put the money back in the bag, zipped it shut, and went to bed. He didn't sleep, but he made the decision, and that was the part that mattered. In the morning, he dropped Brody at school and drove to the Shelby County Sheriff's Department on Poplar Avenue. He waited 45 minutes on a plastic chair in the lobby, the bag on his lap, before a deputy named Flores came out and took his statement. The deputy was professional about it, careful, writing everything down. He asked Owen twice whether he'd found anything else inside the bag. Owen said no both times because there wasn't anything else. When he left the building, Owen felt something he hadn't expected to feel. Not relief, exactly. More like the sensation of having carried something very heavy for a long time and finally setting it down. His back still ached from the weight of it, but his hands were free. He drove to the job site. His foreman, a heavyset man named Chuck who'd known Owen since before Brody was born, caught him on the way in. "You look like you slept about 3 minutes," Chuck said. "About right," Owen said. He picked up his nail gun and went to work. He didn't think about the bag again for 11 days. Then his phone rang with a number he didn't recognize. "Mr. Hatch?" A woman's voice. Measured, careful, with just the faintest trace of something underneath it. Not nervousness exactly, but alertness. The voice of someone who spent a lot of time paying close attention to things. "My name is Lenora Burke. I believe you found something that belongs to me." Owen pulled over to the side of the road. He was between job sites, eating a gas station sandwich in his truck, and the words hit him in the chest before he'd fully processed them. "The bag," he said. "Yes." A pause. Owen waited. "The sheriff's department contacted me this morning," Lenora said. "Deputy Flores told me what happened, that you turned it in, that you didn't take anything." Another pause. Shorter. "I'd like to meet with you if that's all right." He thought about saying no. He thought about all the reasons a person might be carrying $47,000 in cash in an unlatched bag on a wet street, and most of those reasons were the kind that came with complications Owen didn't need. But there was something in her voice that he couldn't quite dismiss, something that sounded less like suspicion or guile and more like— he couldn't find a better word for it, like someone who was genuinely trying to figure out who he was. "Sure," he said. "Where?" The coffee shop she named was on the other side of downtown, the kind of place with exposed brick and handwritten menus on chalkboards and coffee that cost more than Owen spent on lunch. He arrived 5 minutes early and ordered a drip coffee and sat by the window. He was still in his work clothes. Dust on his boots, a smear of joint compound on his left forearm that he'd mostly wiped off on his jeans. And he was acutely aware of that when the woman walked in. She was younger than he'd expected from her voice. Mid-30s, maybe, in a dark blazer and pressed trousers. Her dark hair pulled back with the kind of effortless precision that took either a lot of practice or a lot of money. She moved through the coffee shop like someone who was used to moving through rooms without drawing attention. A skill, Owen recognized. That was harder than it looked. She found him immediately, crossed to the table, and sat down across from him before the barista had even noticed her. "Thank you for coming," she said. Up close, she had dark eyes that moved in a way he recognized. That habit of constantly cataloging an environment, checking exits and faces, the habit you developed when you spent a long time being responsible for something you couldn't afford to lose. He'd seen it in site supervisors. He'd seen it in parents of kids with serious medical problems. He'd seen it in himself in mirrors for the past 14 months. "The money was yours," he said. Lenora wrapped both hands around her coffee cup, which she hadn't ordered but which appeared in front of her anyway. The barista had recognized her, Owen realized, which told him something. "It was. I was carrying it to a closing, a property purchase private sale. The seller insisted on cash. I had a meeting run over. I was rushing. I had the bag and my briefcase and my phone was ringing, and I set the bag down on the sidewalk to deal with the call, and when I turned back around—" She stopped. Something shifted in her expression. Not embarrassment, Owen thought. More like the look of a person who prided herself on not making mistakes confronting evidence that she had. "I turned around and it was gone." "What did you do?" he asked. "Filed a report. Called my attorney. Started trying to reconstruct the situation so I didn't lose the property." She looked at him evenly. "Started assuming I'd never see the money again." "Makes sense," Owen said. "Yes." She held his gaze. "Which is why I'm sitting here." He waited. "Deputy Flores told me you found it on a Thursday evening," she said. "That you brought it in Friday morning. That you declined the finder's fee the department offered." She paused. "He also told me you've been working 2 jobs. That you have a young son. That the money you turned in was more than you make in a year." Owen felt a flicker of something. Not resentment exactly, but the old wariness that came from being known about without permission. "Deputy Flores talks a lot," he said. "He was trying to help me understand." Lenora tilted her head slightly. "He wanted me to understand what you gave up." Owen looked down at his coffee. "I didn't give up anything," he said. "It wasn't mine." The silence between them was the kind that had some weight to it. Not uncomfortable, just real. "I'd like to help you," Lenora said finally. He looked up. "Not as a transaction," she said, before he could respond to whatever his face was doing. "Not a reward. I have no interest in buying a clear conscience. But I've spent the last 11 days thinking about the fact that somewhere in this city there's a man who found almost $50,000 on the street, with no witnesses, with no possible consequences, and walked it into a sheriff's department the next morning." She set her cup down. "That kind of person is either very foolish or very rare, and I don't think you're foolish. Most people would have done the same thing," Owen said. Lenora looked at him with an expression that was not quite pity and not quite admiration, but something more complex than either. "No," she said quietly. "They wouldn't, and I think somewhere you know that." He thought about the kitchen table, the overhead light, the refrigerator cycling on and off. "What kind of help?" he said. She told him she ran a property development company, Burke Holdings, which Owen vaguely recognized. They'd built a mixed-use complex on the south side 2 years ago, the kind of project that generated jobs, not the kind that displaced neighborhoods. She had a project coming up, a renovation of a row of older commercial buildings in Midtown, and she needed crew chiefs with real field experience. Not managers who'd come up through finance. People who knew what they were talking about when they stood on a job site. "I'm not looking for a favor," Owen said carefully. "I know that." Lenora met his eyes. "I'm looking for someone I can trust." He drove home that afternoon and sat in his truck in the parking lot of Brody's school for 15 minutes before the dismissal bell rang. He thought about Brody's inhaler, about the mold behind the bathroom tiles, about Mrs. Garfield's patient, pitying look. He thought about Lenora Burke's voice when she said, "I'm looking for someone I can trust," the flats in it, the absence of performance, like someone stating a fact rather than making a pitch. He went in when the bell rang and found Brody coming down the hallway with his backpack riding too high on his shoulders, the way he always wore it, and his sneakers untied on the left foot, the way they always were, and Owen crouched down and retied the lace, and Brody put one hand on the top of Owen's head for balance, the way he'd done since he was 4 years old and learned to stand still for that. "Good day," Owen said. "We did fractions," Brody said, with the tone of someone reporting a minor natural disaster. "Fractions are useful," Owen said. "That's what Mrs. Pemberton says. Mrs. Pemberton is right." They walked to the truck. Brody climbed in and buckled himself, and immediately started telling Owen about a bird that had flown into the gymnasium window during PE, and everyone had screamed, and the gym teacher, Mr. Dalton, had caught it in his hands and taken it outside. And Brody described it with that total, consuming focus that 7-year-olds brought to the things that genuinely moved them, his hands shaping the story in the air, and Owen drove and listened and thought, "This is enough," meaning not that he didn't want more, but that this, right here, was the thing he was protecting. This was what the kitchen table decision had been about. Not the money. He took the job. It was a better job than any he'd had in 3 years. Better hours, better pay, a crew he could trust because he'd handpicked them, and a project manager who knew construction and didn't second-guess the people doing the work. Owen moved through the first month with the kind of purposeful quiet he'd always been good at on job sites, learning the project, learning the team, staying out of the politics of the office. He didn't see Lenora often. She visited the site twice in the first month, always with her assistant and a set of plans, always focused, always precise. She asked good questions, the kind that showed she'd looked at the drawings and not just the renderings, and she listened to the answers, which Owen had learned was rarer than it should have been at her level. He told himself that was all he noticed about her. He was not entirely honest with himself. The trouble started in the second month. A man named Pollard, one of the building's former owners, had been making noise about the sale, claiming the deal had been misrepresented, that he'd been pressured, that Burke Holdings had used unfair tactics to acquire the property. He'd hired a lawyer and started talking to a journalist at a local news outlet. And suddenly Lenora Burke's name was appearing in articles, with words like aggressive and predatory in the same sentences. Owen read the first article on his phone during lunch and set the phone face down on the concrete. He'd worked enough job sites, been around enough business dealings, to know that disputes like this one were rarely simple. He also knew Lenora Burke from 11 days of observations, the way she ran meetings, the way she treated the site crew, the way she'd spoken to him in that coffee shop, without condescension, without performance. He didn't think she was the person the article described, but he also knew that believing in someone and knowing the facts were two different things. The crew noticed the articles before Owen would have preferred. The talk started the way it always did on job sites, quietly, at the margins, a comment here and a look there. And then one afternoon, one of the younger framers, a kid named Tate, said something over lunch that stuck in Owen's head. "You think she knew what she was buying into?" Tate said. "Like, you think she knew the old guy was gonna fight it?" Owen thought about that question. Then he drove to the sheriff's department after work and asked to speak to Deputy Flores. He didn't have a particular plan. He just knew that Flores had gone to some trouble to understand Owen's situations before telling Lenora about him. And that suggested a person who paid careful attention to the question of who deserved what. He thought Flores might know something about Pollard that the articles didn't mention. He was right. Flores was careful, professional, unable to share anything officially. But there were things that could be said without being said, and Owen had spent enough time around careful men to know how to read between those lines. What he came away with was a clearer picture of Pollard, a man with a history of exactly this kind of dispute, deals he'd entered willingly, and then contested afterward when the terms didn't produce the outcomes he'd wanted, a pattern that stretched back years. Owen drove home and thought about it for 2 days. Then he called Lenora. "I want to tell you something," he said when she picked up. "And I want you to know it's not because I work for you. I'd say this regardless." A short pause. "All right," she said. He told her what he knew. He was careful to separate what was confirmed from what was inference. He told her about Flores's non-answers and what they'd seemed to indicate. He told her she might want her attorney to look into Pollard's history with previous property sales. Another pause. Longer this time. "Why are you telling me this?" she said, not suspiciously. More like someone who genuinely wanted to understand the mechanism of a thing. "Because it's the truth," Owen said, "and you deserve to have it." He heard her exhale slowly on the other end of the line. "You're a very unusual man, Owen Hatch," she said. "People keep telling me that," he said. "I'm starting to think it's not a compliment." She laughed. It was a real laugh, not a polite one, sudden and warm, with some surprise in it, like it had gotten away from her slightly. He found that he wanted to hear it again. The Pollard situation resolved over the next 6 weeks. Lenora's attorneys found the pattern Owen had indicated and used it to dismantle the credibility of Pollard's claims. The journalist published a follow-up that reframed the dispute significantly. The legal proceedings wound down without fanfare. Lenora came to the job site on a Wednesday afternoon and found Owen on the 2nd floor of the main building, reviewing the framing on a load-bearing wall with the structural drawings in his hand. She waited until the other crew members had moved to the far end of the floor before she crossed to where he was standing. "You were right about Pollard," she said. "I know," Owen said. She looked at him with that complicated expression he'd noticed at the coffee shop, the one that was more than one thing at once. "That's not why I came," she said. He waited. "I came because..." She stopped, started again. "I've been running this company for 9 years. I've worked with a lot of people. And I want you to know that what you did, both things, the bag and the Pollard situation, those aren't things I'll forget." Owen set the drawings down on a sawbuck. "I didn't do either of those things for you," he said. "I want to be clear about that." "I know," she said. "I did them because they were the right thing. I know that too." She held his gaze. "That's exactly what I'm telling you." He looked at her. She looked at him. Somewhere below them, one of the crew fired up a circular saw, and the sound filled the building and then faded. "Brody has an appointment with the asthma specialist next week," Owen said. It was not what he'd intended to say. But it was what came out. First time, 14 months of trying to get him in. Lenora's expression shifted. The professional composure she wore like a second skin settled into something different, quieter, more human. "How old is he again?" 7, Owen said. He's a good kid. He's really something." He hadn't said that to anyone. Not in those words. He hadn't let himself, because letting yourself say that out loud meant you were letting yourself feel the full weight of what you were responsible for, and sometimes that weight was the only thing holding you upright, and the thing most likely to put you on the floor at the same time. Lenora was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What does he like?" It was such a simple question, such an unexpected one. "Birds," Owen said after a moment. "He's really into birds right now. Has been since a bird flew into his school gymnasium and the gym teacher caught it in his hands. He paused. He wants to be an ornithologist or a gym teacher. He says he hasn't decided. Lenora smiled. Not the polished public smile he'd seen her use in meetings, a different, one smaller and more real. That's a good problem to have, she said. It didn't happen quickly. That was the part of the story Owen would always be particular about. When he told it later, the pace of it. Neither of them rushed anything. He was a widower with a 7-year-old son, and a mountain of practical responsibilities, and an instinct toward caution that 14 months of holding his family together by himself had only deepened. She was a woman who'd built something significant entirely on her own terms and learned to trust carefully and slowly, because the alternative had cost her in the past. They had coffee, then lunch, then, once, dinner, at a restaurant Brody would have described as really fancy, which Owen only considered appropriate because he'd had the jacket from his wife's cousin's wedding in his closet for 3 years without wearing it. Brody met her in November at a park near their apartment. Because Owen wasn't the kind of person who introduced his son to someone without thinking carefully about it first. He'd told Brody that a friend from work was going to meet them. And Brody, who was less interested in the social machinations of adults than in the 3 Canada geese he'd spotted near the pond, had responded with okay and immediately started walking toward the water. Lenora arrived and found them at the edge of the pond. Brody crouched in the dry grass, with Owen standing slightly behind him, both of them watching the geese with the focused quiet of people who understood each other without needing to fill the silence. She stood back for a moment, watched them. Then she walked over and crouched down beside Brody and said, without any preamble, "Is that a Canada goose?" Brody looked at her with an expression of serious evaluation. "Yes," he said. "There are 3. That one has a tag on its leg, see?" He pointed. "That means someone's been tracking it." "Where do you think it came from?" she said. Brody considered this with full sincerity. "Maybe northern Michigan," he said. "They migrate. But some of them are resident geese now, which means they stopped migrating. Because of us. Because of parks and lawns and things. Does that bother them, do you think?" Brody thought about it. "I think they adapted," he said. "That's what birds do, they figure it out." Lenora looked at him for a moment. Then she looked up at Owen. He didn't say anything. She looked back at the geese. The following spring, Brody drew a picture at school. He drew it during free period, unprompted, with the careful attention to detail he brought to anything involving birds or animals or things he considered important. He brought it home in his backpack and set it on the kitchen table without ceremony. Owen found it that evening and stood over it for a long time. It was a picture of 3 people at a pond. A tall figure, clearly his father, identified by the work boots Brody always drew on him, and a smaller figure beside him, and a woman with dark hair. All 3 of them looking at the water. Geese on the water. A tag on one goose's leg, carefully drawn in pencil. At the bottom in Brody's uneven 2nd grade printing, the ones who stayed. Owen folded it carefully and put it in the drawer where he kept important things. Brody's birth certificate, his wife's photograph, the lease on the new apartment they'd moved into in January, with the bedroom that had enough room for Brody's bird books and a small desk and a window that looked east toward the direction things flew from and also the direction things returned to. The drawer closed. The light in the kitchen was warm and ordinary. Outside, somewhere above the street, a bird was moving through the dark, reading landmarks Owen couldn't see, navigating by instincts that had been refined over longer than either of them would live to count, and finding its way back, the way things did, to the place it recognized as home.